we all heard Eric talk about how the finance industry is really preying on the economy of Puerto Rico. And Congresswoman Velazquez has really taken a leadership role in taking those folks on. And she's doing it by reforming the very archaic financial system, or financial regulatory system. Congresswoman Velazquez is addressing deficiencies in the Investment Act of 1940, this 75-year-old act that allows mutual funds and investment companies to go to Puerto Rico and to engage in behavior that would be illegal if they did it on the mainland. She's recently introduced a bill called the Hedge Funds Sunshine Act of 2015 that will, when passed, create real transparency for hedge fund investments in the United States. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to someone who's shown tremendous leadership on these issues, Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez.
Thank you, Brad, and good afternoon, everyone. I have some friends or maybe some enemies, and I don't know which one to pick on. The NRA introduced legislation 2 weeks ago, or the hedge funds dealing with Puerto Rico. We all come at this problem with different perspectives and experiences. The financial crisis in Puerto Rico originally drew my attention to hedge funds, as the island's economy took a dramatic turn for the worse in the last 2 years. Bond prices plummeted and yields soared. Hedge funds saw this as an opportunity and began investing heavily. Today, they hold as much as, some say 20%, others say 30% of Puerto Rico's securities. Unfortunately, they are using this leverage to lobby for draconian cuts that harm residents of Puerto Rico. For example, they issued a report that said Puerto Rico could avoid defaulting by cutting spending. That report accused the island where 56% of children live in poverty, of spending too much on education, even though the government has already closed down almost 100 schools so far this year. Similarly, cutting basic services will hurt working families and retirees. This is morally unacceptable. And we know that austerity plans have been debunked. What we need is economic growth policies coming from the federal government. And when you ask the question about if we rescue them, if we allow for them to have an orderly legal proceedings that would allow for them to restructure their public debt, we have to remind the people here that it is the federal government's own policies that have brought Puerto Rico to this point. When Puerto Rican American citizens pay the same amount of taxes when it comes to Medicare and Social Security, and yet they don't get the same amount of investment in terms of access to quality health care that we do in America, it creates the perfect storm to bring Puerto Rico to this point. When in 1996, Section 936 was repealed or was grandfathered, and you trace and you track the crisis in Puerto Rico, you're going to see that it goes to the repeal of 936. A lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of people started to leave the island. The working, most productive workforce started to leave the island, going to Florida, to Orlando. We have, 4 years ago, I went to Orlando to campaign. 8 years ago, I went to Orlando to campaign for presidential candidates. And to see that we went in Florida from 400,000 Puerto Ricans to 1.1 in less than 10 years, it tells you something. At the same time they call for these cuts, hedge funds are opposing sensible steps that would allow Puerto Rico to regain its footing. Permitting Chapter 9 bankruptcy would allow a small sliver of the island's debt to be managed through judicial proceedings, just like all 50 states can already do. Let me remind you that when hedge funds said that we are changing the rules of the game, Puerto Rico was covered and had bankruptcy protection from 1933 to 1984. When bankruptcy reform took place here in Congress, the U.S. territories were excluded. Puerto Rico was excluded. So we changed the rules of the game on Puerto Rico. But the hedge funds hold firm. They would rather see the economic future of the island vanish than take a modest discount on the debt they bought, even though they knew the island's debt was in distress when they purchased it. They saw Chapter 9 is not fair because they said Chapter 9 is not fair because it will change the rules on them in the middle of the game. Yet, that is exactly what hedge funds do to governments and taxpayers when they buy and sell large positions of distressed debt. This happens throughout our economy every single day. Hedge funds game the system at the expense of the rest of us. The fact is, hedge funds play a significant role in our economy, but we do not always know just how much influence they wield. That is why I introduced legislation, H.R. 3921, the Hedge Fund Sunshine Act. This bill will require hedge funds to disclose their major investment activities to the public. This will not correct all the problems, but taking a clear-eye look at how these funds function will be a good start. When it comes to disclosure, hedge funds are already subject to some requirements, but they are insufficient. Dodd-Frank requires certain hedge funds to register with the SEC. Yet, full investment information is only available to regulators, not the public. The current law requires certain hedge funds to file quarterly reports disclosing their holdings, as well as other reports regarding the large acquisitions of equity securities. However, these reporting requirements are not enough. The public and policymakers need a full picture of how this industry impacts capital markets, governments, corporations, employees, consumers, and indeed, our daily lives. Keep in mind, this is a $3 trillion industry that operates with significant secrecy, and that leaves room, I am afraid, for abuse and greed at the expense of the American people. Dodd-Frank disclosures, for example, are not public. While the 1934 Act disclosures are public, they only apply to equity holdings, not debt. They also do not account for derivative positions, which can be used to circumvent filings. Given that many funds take large positions in government debt issues, such as in Puerto Rico, there is a need for accurate and timely reporting on hedge funds' bond holdings as well. To increase transparency, my legislation requires hedge funds to meet stronger disclosure requirements when acquiring equity securities. First, it will strengthen disclosure for hedge funds regarding their acquisition of large equity positions. Under current law, entities must report to the SEC within 10 days if they acquire a 5% position in such securities. For hedge funds, the legislation would lower this threshold to 1% and require such positions to be reported within 5 days. We will also begin accounting for derivatives, which are often used to skirt federal disclosure requirements. This means the SEC and the public will have a greater awareness and information about hedge funds' investment actions. Second, the legislation requires that hedge funds report quarterly for all securities in which they hold a 1% or greater ownership stake. Notably, this will apply to debt securities, which are excluded under current law. For the first time, hedge funds will have to report to regulators when they begin buying up the debt of a locality, a state, or a municipal authority. It will also account for derivative holdings, and this information will be made publicly available so that the American people can finally see what is happening behind the curtain. The situation in Puerto Rico demonstrates why we need these changes. While we know hedge funds are playing a significant role in the debt crisis, it is hard to determine their exact positions. The only information we have is anecdotal. Of course, it isn't just about Puerto Rico. While it is the island today, tomorrow it might be California or Illinois that funds hedge funds capitalizing on their debt problems. Certainly, there are times hedge funds provide liquidity in markets and do play a constructive role. But let me ask this, shouldn't we hold hedge funds to some basic transparency requirements so we know how they are using their leverage? As a nation, we need to take a hard look at what role these funds are playing in our economy, and this bill will be an important first step in that process. In closing, I want to thank all of you for being here. These issues are often overlooked, largely because some pretty powerful interests would rather avoid scrutiny. And you all know that they're working very hard. They have very powerful lobbyists that are basically preventing the Congress to allow for Puerto Rico to have bankruptcy protection, and that is wrong. That is wrong because one way or another, we will face this issue. Whether Puerto Ricans living by the thousands, humanitarian crisis, this is how everyone in Puerto Rico, this is how everyone, Eric, everyone describes the situation. The American people who live in Puerto Rico, they deserve better. And I want to make sure that we going to start raising our voices so that the hedge funds know that they cannot get away without the type of scrutiny that they deserve. Thank you very much.
Undercurrent under the surface makes the mainstream get so nervous. It's time for purpose, for news to serve us, not with propaganda they use to hurt us.